Well, good day, everybody. It's time for us to dig back into the text of Second Corinthians. We have Doy Moyer and Terry Francis joining with myself, Philip Martin, for another series of studies. These will be taking place every Thursday as we are available to walk through the text of Second Corinthians. We're very thankful for Doy to be able to join us today to introduce the text. Doy, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine,
Excellent.
surviving, looking forward to greater things this summer.
Yeah, well, the whole summer plan that I had laid out is no longer a plan. It's a distant memory, and I have no idea what's going on for the next 30 to 2,000 days. I think that's, probably a better perspective anyway. Terry, how are you doing?
Doing great. Good to be with everybody, and really looking forward to our time with Doy today and our study as we begin second letter here to the Corinthians. Or is it the third? Maybe that's part of our discussion.
Maybe it's the eighth. We don't know. That's the interesting aspect about this. All right, so digging into a couple of things. We're going to try to do a good job introducing the text. Should we have time, we might begin to walk through the text itself. We'll kind of see how it goes. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to incorporate those into the chat feeds, and we'll address them as they come up. So now, in looking at this letter, we'll kind of walk around the bigger picture things, paying attention to some of that as it folds into the big narrative. Remember, if you've been with us already, we spent, I guess, 19 sessions going through the text of First Corinthians, including some of the introduction that's in there. If you go back to the very first episode of that series, you can get some of the big picture stuff. But let's at least identify some key things that are important for us right now. So with First and Second Corinthians, as they're laid out in a Protestant Bible format, what are we talking about here? Like, what kind of information is this? What's its time frame? There's different types of literature in the Bible. I think it's important to at least hit some of those bases before we get too far into the specific letter itself. So, what you guys got? Ask and start away. Doy?
Well, I would start by just recognizing that Corinth was, on the one hand, a pretty amazing city. And you guys might have talked about this when you started First Corinthians. But every time I look at First and Second Corinthians, I think, here's this great Roman city that really, was hadn't been around very long, as in its form as Paul knew it. Julius Caesar had a big impact on that, and you've got a lot of Latin speaking influence and everything here. And so you've got wealth, you've got slavery, you've got a mixture of everything coming into this city. And it's a great place from which the gospel can spread on the one hand, but on the other hand, you're looking at a very troubled church. And a church that has caused Paul a great amount of grief. And I do think, there's kind of an intersection of exciting possibility from a great city on the one hand, and learning from what a church can do when it's not really all together on the other hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the community of believers in Corinth, if you would think back and just in terms of the first Corinthian letter, is full of tremendous potential that is broken by their failure to live up to that potential and kind of slip back into the cultural sameness of Corinth. You see them interacting with an idea of I can be better than you. You see them engaging in spiritual conflict in the ways that the world fights against each other, going to law against one another, creating class barriers and distinctions, which seem to be fairly typical for the worldview in that area and time. And it manifested itself in a series of problems. all of that, our hope is that the Second Corinthian letter, as recorded by the scriptures for us, answers all these questions. Like, will they solve the problem? I tend to look at these two books as a cliffhanger in a literary sense, where First Corinthians is the first half of the conclusion episode of a series, and Second Corinthians is when you come back and you're like, oh, here's all the things I missed. And there's that space in the middle where some things happen that you don't really get to see the how. 1 Corinthians 5, we've got that great pressure cooker story of Paul describing a challenge to the church there, and then 2 Corinthians, maybe chapter 2, hopefully answers some of that. And so, as a literary book side of things, as a way God is telling us, this is a kind of, the letters are different than a lot of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, and even like Luke and Acts as a compatriot pair of books, they are more historical in some senses, where they're moving through larger time periods, or their history that's designed to teach. The letters, the epistles, are much more interactive with the audience of believers. And so understanding who they are is probably even more important there than some of the sections of the larger parts of the Old Testament history books.
Yeah, there's a lot of background information that we don't have, but we kind of read through the text itself. And I know you talked about this in First Corinthians. Just, there's some, what we might some call mirror reading, where you're reading something and you don't have exactly what they said, but you can get a sense of what they were talking about, or what the occasion was, based on the response that Paul gives. So there's a lot of that going on, and it requires some pretty careful reading to get at that.
Yeah. Terry?
It's interesting that, these epistles are somewhat reactionary, like you said, unlike a historical recording, which kind of just records those events. The first epistle, as we looked at, was reactionary to largely the report he had and the letter that he received, things that they had wrote questions about. And the second letter seems to be reactionary to a report he receives from Titus, because he's not, apparently from what you read, able, even though he wanted to go to Corinth between the two epistles. So what's interesting is when you kind of compare those two and you look, there's things that they've done well that they've kind of caught up on, or they've fixed to a degree, and yet there's things in this letter that not only have they it's not things necessarily we see in the first letter, but other issues that arise. I think one of the great lessons from that is, so often we fix one issue, but that doesn't mean that we're done. There's always other things that arise that have to be handled. And I think that's pretty powerful and important to kind of consider in all of that when you look into it.
Yeah, and Doyle uses the term mirror reading. Another way to think about this concept is that you just have one half of a phone call. You're sitting in a room somewhere and someone's on a phone. And I know I do this all the time. If someone's loud talking on their phone in a restaurant, I make up the other half of the conversation. I pretend that I'm on the other end of the line and just kind of have a little game with it. And it's hilarious to me. I don't know if it's hilarious to anybody else, but we do this all the time.
Jill doesn't find it as funny as you do.
Probably true.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, when we're reading the Bible, we have to be careful that we're not just wholesale inventing what we think was happening. We have to use the information that's actually in the text to get there. I see First and Second Corinthians here as I mean, Paul's always writing from a very personal perspective. He's not just cold and emotionless when he writes, but these letters in particular, I think, are that way because he's really defending his own honor, and he's having to grapple with some very personal, injurious kind of things that people have said about him. And, who wouldn't feel that to some degree? And Paul is having to multitask. I mean, this is what, mid-50s. And Paul has written to the Corinthians a year before. And and it's not too long after this that he's going to write to the Romans, and so he's a lot of multitasking stuff going on. As his great concern, as he even mentions in 2 Corinthians 11, his great concern for the churches. Uh, Paul's having to grapple with a number of very personal issues, and it's hard on him, and you can tell it's hard on him.
Yeah.
And so you get the heart of Paul in this in a way that maybe some other epistles don't give us.
And that's even more so him defending himself in this epistle than the first one. There was a brief section in there where he talked about himself and don't I have the right to do this, but here it is much more in depth. And it's almost, I think a lot of ways to look at this is the first letter that we have, he's spending the majority of that time trying to get them to reconcile with each other to be more united. But this second letter, there's a lot of emphasis of him reconciling back with them and being more united, because in the process, it appears, if you kind of read into it, like we said, that while they became united, there were some driving forces there that kind of, especially it seems with the people he converted, pushed them away from him. So he's coming in, and it is deeply personal. I think the second letter is more personal than the first in that sense. And kind of see that kind of ringing through a lot.
And we might wonder, why would Paul be so interested in defending himself? I mean, shouldn't he be defending the gospel? Well, in reality, he's doing both, because his credibility is at stake. His authority, what people view about him as an apostle, was important. If he's not really what he's been cracked up to be here, then why should we listen to Paul at all?
Yeah.
And then that would destroy even what he said in the first letter. So there's a lot at stake with him, and I think a lot of it is kind of grounded in the fact that Paul himself has been suffering for Christ. It's kind of that age-old question: if God is with you, why would you be suffering this way? And here Paul is defending the cross. He's suffering for the cross. He's going to prison for it. He's being beaten for it. All of these factors that, I like to read 2 Corinthians 11 once in a while to remind myself what Paul went through when I begin to think, life has gotten really hard because the air conditioning went out. And we have to kind of remind ourselves of that. But Paul has to defend himself based on some charges of what we might think of as these guys who consider themselves super apostles, who come in and challenge Paul's authority. And a lot of it very personally cutting, because, you're suffering, and that means you really can't be what you claim to be.
Yeah.
And it seems these are personal attacks, but I think they're rooted also in the fact that not only is it just personal attacks for like power, but beyond that, these super or false apostles are teaching some things contrary to Paul, and as a way to gain that authority for themselves and a way to establish their teaching over his, they're attacking his credibility. So, that even starts off from in chapter 1, where it's like Paul's defending why he's not been to Corinth yet. And look, in the first letter, I said that I wanted to go to Corinth, not there yet. Why did that happen? Because it seems like these guys are attacking. Well, look, Paul won't even come back and visit, as he said.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to just kind of see how all that goes.
There's also a motivational factor that I think is a really important thing to remind ourselves of. In 1 Corinthians and in the book of Acts, you can see that Paul had a strong relationship with the brethren in Corinth. He genuinely knew them, genuinely cared about them, even though he couldn't physically be with them. And that created this relationship that expands beyond just, here's some information, I'm done, fix it yourselves. Much in the same way that I know most brethren who have their jobs or preachers or their lives have caused them to move to different areas, our heart stays with the families in Christ we've known in other areas, and we are concerned about them. Now, we live in a time frame where I can kind of either go visit personally for the most part, or give a call and have an answer to these concerns, how they're doing, what's their health like, in minutes to hours. We're talking maybe anywhere from 9 to 18 months time frame range wise between Paul's letter arriving at Corinth and some word coming back to him. Where possibly Titus, 2 Corinthians 7, is the message or go between, as we've kind of mentioned already. Can you imagine the depth of anxiety if you genuinely care about the spiritual condition of these believers and you simply don't know? We tend to think that being an apostle and being inspired means you've got a computed answer Rolodex that says, oh, they're fine, God just told me. Oh, this is good. Oh, I'll just read this sentence that God just sent me on my device, and that's my inspired message for the day. That doesn't match the context of the scriptures, and it certainly doesn't match the depth of Paul's concern. He doesn't know, and he does care, and that creates in all humans anxiety. And so he's anxious for them in this middle space, and you can see it in his tone. At least I can read it in his tone. Maybe others don't read it that way, but
Yeah, and I see circles of concern here. I mean, we're talking about Paul being concerned about his own reputation, but it's more than that. I mean, if his reputation is shot, then that's going to say something about the Christians at Corinth and what may happen to them. And then there's another issue that we find later in the book, and that is there is a need in Judea that he wants them to participate in. And how's he going to convince them to do that and help out other brethren who are in a very difficult circumstance? So my point is that you've got kind of circles of concern that need to be dealt with, and Paul's at the center of that. But I don't think it's Paul being selfish. I just want people to think highly of me. Right. It's that people need to realize that I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ, and then that filters out into the instructions and everything else that has to happen.
Well, I think it's in here in 2 Corinthians, he uses this term of being an ambassador. When you think about an ambassador, that's a representative. So when you attack Paul, you're attacking Christ in that sense. And you think about 1 Corinthians 11, we talked about imitate me as I also imitate Christ. Well, if you attack him in that sense, that's also an attack on his authority and on his apostleship. So I don't see it as selfish at all. I see it as this is what's needed in order to keep them on the right track. And
I think Paul represents, he represents Christ, of course, but in a sense, he represents the suffering child of God anywhere.
Yeah.
If people are going to look at someone who's suffering for Christ and think there's something wrong with suffering for the sake of someone who's supposed to have been risen from the dead, that's not a victorious thing, and you're expecting everything to be different. And so in a sense, by vindicating himself, he vindicates all sufferers who suffer for the cause of Christ. So it's kind of a bigger picture idea.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that going on. And I kind of see some of this other stuff playing out on the story of this journey. Paul is going to be hearing different things from different places he goes. And he kind of refers to in his letters on a regular basis, a report I heard, it's been said to me. He says that in the Corinthian letters. He says that in more broad terms in the rest of his writing. We're already recognizing that Paul's ability to labor in the gospel and devote himself fully to it that isn't always constant. Sometimes he's tent making. Sometimes he's waiting for someone to be a co-laborer. We learn that about Paul. And sometime in this 1 to 2 year range between the first letter and the second letter, Paul does meet up with Titus. He does bring this second letter. And that brings me a second point. We talked about how we're looking for resolution to a lot of the 1 Corinthian issues. It's going to take 1 to 2 years for Paul to learn about them and potentially for them to even take place. Like, we don't know how quickly stuff gets solved. And the reason I include that right here is our culture on both of those issues of timeliness and resolution of problems, we want them now. Like, we are way into a culture that seeks instant satisfaction, not like gratification, which is a separate thing, but I want this satisfied right now. We fix this right now. And that is not at all what seems to take place with the church at Corinth. And in many cases, none of the believers in the first century seem to have that instantaneous problem solving that we all want. And so that's part of the backdrop and the context of this letter as well.
There's some parts here where you see there's resolution. For instance, we've kind of pointed out 1 Corinthians 5, there seems to be resolution pointed out in chapter 2 of 2 Corinthians. But then there's other areas where there doesn't seem to be resolution. In fact, in some places you'll see where it seems like the problem may have even kind of got more complicated by new things entering into the picture as you read through. So it's pretty interesting to see that in this window of time that we would want everything resolved and fixed. And I do think the church at Corinth is to be commended, because there are things they did resolve in that brief amount of time, or at least were on the path to that. But not everything was fixed in that time. And we're terrible at patience. I mean, if you want to think about what we're going through right now, I mean, the fact of the matter is our current distress has revealed just how impatient we are in so many ways. And so from that standpoint, it's pretty interesting to see that principle laid forth about waiting on change and letting it to happen in the way that it can be actually effective and correct, rather than pushing it through. And so that's seen here as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at, again, kind of this overarching view of both of these epistles, Paul is displaying tremendous patience. How many of us would take a church like Corinth and write it off and say they're not sound? You know, look at all these problems they have. And Paul is just, you know, babying them, so to speak. I mean, he's really trying. I mean, sometimes he speaks pretty bluntly to them, but at the same time, he's really patient because he believes they can get through this. And that's a great example for us, great example for preachers today. The need for patience in dealing with congregational issues. I mean, how many of us have had problems of the nature of Corinth?
Yeah, a way that I've tried to think through it, which is different than how I used to see these things of relationships between evangelist preachers and congregations, is to look at it in this lens. Can my weaknesses grow in the midst of their weaknesses, or will they be covered by their strengths and my strengths? And so I don't want to get weaker, and I don't want them to get weaker, but maybe my strength and their strength can be complements to one another. And if you think about Corinth in that regard, there's a secondary question that I don't think we ask very often. What kind of strength did Corinth provide Paul? Because we think, I know I have thought of him in this way at times. Oh, he's just super tough and concrete. He's Paul, you know, he's an apostle. He's got it all together. And the more you kind of think about that relationship, you begin to realize that there's a lot that Corinth provides to Paul that Paul needs in the relationship of Christians together. Because Paul is the one who talks to them about every joint supplying what they need. And so Corinth supplies to Paul in some ways too.
Well, I would think that as he kind of sees the resolution coming in 2 Corinthians to the problems that were happening, you know, a good bit before, there is going to be some encouragement to that. He wants that relationship between them to be good, to be something that is mutually beneficial. As we open up the letter, it seems that he still has some convincing to do to get them to understand the relationship of his suffering and say the power of the Holy Spirit is something that they need to see. Rather than questioning his apostleship because he suffers, they need to understand that God was going to reveal his glory through suffering. And the message of the gospel is, I mean, yes, it is about the resurrection, but it's also about the cross. And Paul was in his life displaying the cross. that would result in ultimate victory. And I think, again, it just challenges us to recognize that suffering for the cause of Christ is not something to be ashamed of. People may question it. They always have, fussed about people claiming to be Christians who suffer. I mean, this is an age-old issue, but at the end of the day, we are servants of the cross. And we need to see the relationship there, that God can reveal himself, he can reveal his glory through his suffering servants. Jesus is the ultimate suffering servant, and we're following him. Peter makes a big deal out of that in his epistle.
Yeah, I've got some notes I kind of wrote over the prep phase of this, that this letter is also kind of a heralding of his arrival. You could kind of map it out and see that it's going to have maybe 2 to 4 months before his arrival time there. They're going to get this letter, and he's planning and hoping to be there next. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 talk about his intentions and plans. Even with him early on in the letter, dealing with the challenges of logistics. God is moving him around on the chessboard, and that's part of the issue. But travel over long distances in the first century is not super consistent. And so that creates another conflict. And that's why in chapter 2, he talks about missing Titus. Like, he wanted to see Titus, but he couldn't find Titus. He sought him out, and he was not able to make that connection. I think it's around verses 11 or 12 or so that takes place in chapter 2. So with this letter coming in on the structure of, here's some things to get ready for. Some of it is the financial stuff, but also there's a deep spiritual dialogue that's going to move to a new level. As hard as some of the things he said in the first letter were, I'll suggest that because this is now in a more sensitive area, and he's going to be coming there soon, it's perhaps wise to think about the 2 Corinthian letter as even more sensitive or uncomfortable for both the hearers and for Paul, because it's moving to a personal conflict, confrontation, or resolution phase, if you will.
Well,
I wondered what the. Well, go ahead, Dwight.
I was just going to say, like we've indicated, this may well be the most emotional of all of Paul's epistles.
Yeah.
Precisely because it's such a personal thing. Can you imagine the excitement of going into a place like Corinth initially? Maybe even the fear. Paul was told by the Lord that he had many people there, and so he needed to have courage. And so you're going to have some converts, you're going to have some success, it's going to be exciting, and then all of a sudden you're wrapped up in turmoil, and you want to be with them, you want to visit them, but then you suffer such humiliation that when you leave, you don't know what the course is going to be or what the future is going to be. And again, many people might just tend to write that off. I'm done with them. If they're going to treat me like that, if they're going to be that way, I don't want anything to do with them. But here he comes back in this epistle with such an emotional, heartfelt appeal to try to get them to understand the purpose of his suffering, the need for recognizing his apostolic authority, and to recognize that their own spiritual well-being is at stake here. And he's kind of pulling out all the stops.
I think it's interesting to think about the dynamic of his wanting to go there. So he has that anxiety of what's been said. This letter comes in, and you could assume when he shows up soon after this, as his plan was, he's not heard back from this letter. So the anxiety associated with that. I also wonder about the flip side. What about the anxiety of these opponents who kind of attacked Paul's apostleship and credibility? Just imagine being them when he shows up, and here comes Paul walking in.
Well, and that seems to me,
think about that.
Seems to me part of the reason why, it looks to me, kind of focus on his physical appearance. look at him. He's weak. He's bow-legged or
coward.
whatever you want to say about him. I mean, he's,
Yeah.
but he's also reflecting someone who has suffered a great deal. And they're using that against him when the reality is his suffering ought to be seen as something that glorifies Christ.
Well, and I don't think any of us look at his suffering and what he endured as weakness today. When we look back at that, we obviously see the strength of his character and his faith that got him through all of those things. And it's pretty interesting just to think about that in those regards. It's not the same as Peter showing up and you've attacked Peter, but still, you think about this. Here's an inspired apostle, and he's going to show up. And you've called him weak, and you've called him out, and yet here he's going to come. I just think it's interesting to think about that. And that anxiety, I connect that a little bit to Jacob when he's getting ready to meet Esau. I just wonder, from both sides, you think about that anxiety of what's going to go on in this meeting and how's that going to happen. Kind of that scene there. It's just interesting to me to think along those lines from that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of that anxiety of, okay, you got these super apostles who are opposing Paul. If Paul's going to come, how exactly is he going to deal with them?
Yeah.
And he's not that strong, it seems. So maybe, so it seems to me a lot of what's going to happen will be a bit surprising to them.
Yeah.
Well, and you see some hints at this. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about refraining from coming. And so that he's keying into some of the parts of this process. I love how Doy's talking about these super apostles. He's using that in sarcasm. The folks are like, I'm so much more of an apostle than Paul was ever an apostle. And he describes his strengths as all of his weaknesses, all of the brokenness, all of the suffering he's endured. Here is the testimony that you need to look at to evaluate my authenticity. And here's the balance to it. Look back at all the Old Testament prophets. When they came after a scathing judgment from Jehovah, from the Old Testament narratives, the outcomes were always awful for Israel. Judgment wasn't pleasant. And so this delay that we could probably put into 3 reasons why there's a delay. God is using him elsewhere. There is some difficulty in travel, not getting information, but also Paul being patient or choosing to wait. Because if he comes with a scathing rebuke, the stories of the New Testament balance the stories of the Old Testament. People have already died for lying. That's already in the narrative prior to this. That God strikes them down because of their spiritual rebellion. That's part of the story of the gospel's spread. Paul cares about these brethren at Corinth. His, we could say, reluctance or his refraining, if we're going to use the ESV text there, saves them by giving them more time to repent. Is a way that I kind of think through part of this as well. Because he's not weak. That's the whole irony of all of this, is that Paul, though perceived as weak, isn't weak because Christ liveth in him and he's a servant of Jehovah. So both of those slaying attacks on him are just full of silly irony in the big picture.
Well, it's interesting what you said about the refraining. Earlier he says, I wanted to come so that I could give you a second experience of grace. And then he kind of ends that section by going, but it's good that I refrained so that you had more time so I could actually give you that grace. It's kind of interesting to see that kind of connection in that section there, which I'm sure we'll get into the next time. It's also interesting to, Doy keeps talking about the super apostles and their boasting and their greatness and being better than Paul. And this idea of boasting is mentioned a lot through the letter. And yet when it comes to Paul, it's always him boasting, as Doy's pointed out, in his weaknesses. And of course, the kind of pinnacle of that is over in chapter 12, where he really focuses in on that idea of boasting and weakness because of God's grace. And so it's just kind of interesting to see that theme kind of develop over the course of the letter in those contrasts between the two.
Well, and I see 2 Corinthians as really kind of the pinnacle of the biblical theme of strength through weakness, because Paul is the embodiment here of the purposes of Christ. I mean, think about Jesus himself. You know, it's through the cross that he gained the crown. Um, and Paul seems to have some concern about that. I mean, you know, his thorn in the flesh, and you know, isn't there any way to get rid of that? Well, strength is perfected through weakness. That's a hard lesson. And if the Corinthians can grasp that, then they won't look down on Paul. And like I said, this is bigger than just a defense of Paul the person. This is a defense of a thematic concept throughout Scripture. Because if you're going to think that less of Paul because he suffers for the cause of Christ, what are you going to think of Christ himself? And then when you face, personally, when you face the suffering that may come as a result of being a child of God, what will your response then be? If you somehow view suffering as a bad thing for the cause of Christ, how will you respond? So it all comes back to Jesus himself. Strength comes through weakness. Christ is the illustration of that to a T, and Paul is mirroring that through his life, and they needed to understand that.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I look at this thematic element here is to remind myself that while 1 Corinthians 13 is a text we turn to into chapter 14 to talk about love, 2 Corinthians is the personification of that love in Paul's relationship to the church at Corinth, because his suffering fuels his commitment to them. And we read the First Corinthian letter excerpts at weddings when everything is perfect. But we read from 2 Corinthians more often, at least I do, when I'm helping folks think through how they might solve a challenge in their marriage or in their relationships. Because Paul's model of behavior is exactly that. Weakness that God makes strong. And I think that's something that's a hard lesson to learn. And if the brethren at Corinth learn it, they'll be that much more useful in the kingdom. And then as a first century world applied now to our 21st century world, how much more useful will we be if we learn that same lesson? Useful in the kingdom, useful in our marriages, useful in the congregational context, etc.
Well, and if it was hard for the Christians at Corinth to learn that lesson, again, you're looking at people who might have some wealth, might have status. Mm-hmm. You're looking in this honor-shame culture at a situation where Paul is essentially saying, look, you got to realize that what you think is honor really is more of a shame, and what the world looks at as a shame is really something that is honorable. And so it's kind of turning the honor shame concept on its head here. And you know, if they needed to learn that lesson in a culture that had wealth and all kinds of opportunities to sin, we certainly need to learn it in 21st century America.
Yeah, and we're given. And I know that we've kind of made some plays on our current compressed context, which is at times distressing in many ways. But yet, life has always afforded us the opportunity to understand this and to learn from it. And we really should be, at least on a practical level, when we walk through these letters, do our very best to set aside our arrogance and our pre-assumptions of what we know and who we are, and then dig deeper into the reality of what a servant in Christ looks like. Paul, a submissive man whose early interaction with the gospel was all arrogance and all pride. And over the molding process of transformation, all those lies of pride and arrogance that he had were all made irrelevant, because in accepting what the king offered to him, he became of greater use outside of Israel than he ever thought he would have been inside. There's a lot of that narrative turn of the tables that takes place in Paul's life, Saul to Paul and all of that. That also is being seen in these letters, I think, in some ways too. Because who would have ever thought a Jew of Jews, a Hebrew of Hebrews, would weep tears over Gentiles who he was trying to draw to God.
Well, and to weep over people that, prior times he would have persecuted and been a party to their death. But then I think, to when Jesus appeared to Saul on his journey to Damascus in Acts 9, and, he's told right up front, you're going to suffer for me. And can you imagine hearing that? I mean, all the changes that have to take place, but then the anxiety that would come from perhaps not even realizing the full impact of what that would mean.
Yeah.
You're going to suffer for me. Jesus wasn't saying you're going to have to go without air conditioning. This is going to be tough. And Paul understood it later in Acts 14 when he says, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom. Tribulation, distress, persecutions, those kinds of sufferings were going to be, par for the course for Paul and for many Christians. And here we are kind of on the other end of this thinking, how willing would we be to go through that kind of suffering for the cause of Christ? And that's a hard question. It ought to make us uncomfortable.
Yeah. And it should have made the brethren at Corinth even more aware of the Paul they're going to meet versus the Paul they remembered. And in the middle is the Paul described by the super apostles, who are all hyped up on their awesomeness. Because the way the letters present Corinth is that they were not really ready, especially the first letter, for the Paul that would come. And even he talks about it. He's like, look, I had to make a decision. In what way am I going to come to you? And even now, as he is waiting or refraining from coming, he's doing it to give them every opportunity to make things right before he gets there. And I think that's a second application of that point in verse 23 of chapter 1. Look, you make sure your house is ready. Get everything in order and take the time that God has granted you to have things in order so that when I come, it's going to look in a much healthier way on the spiritual plane.
I think one of the things to point out too about this suffering we talked about so much is it's not manufactured by Paul, just to be clear, that it occurred to Paul because of who he was. And the reason I think that's important is today what we often consider suffering is things we manufacture. And what I mean by that, it's sometimes we respond trying to be martyrs in a sense if we're not careful. And that's not the same thing as what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about suffering, there has to be this warning. You don't go out and try to create that in your life. This is suffering that comes because you're merely being who you're supposed to be and doing what you're supposed to do. And I think that's just important to kind of plug in as a reminder to all of us. When you go out and manufacture your suffering, that's not real suffering. That's not what's being talked about here.
Yeah.
And it's not talking about things that just happen to us as human beings either.
Right.
And I've been thinking through most of this discussion about Luke 9:23, and I've often said, the hardest command to me anyway in Scripture is right there in Luke 9:23. If anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up the cross daily, and follow me. Self-denial is the issue here. And taking up the cross, we often say, well, I've got a burden to bear. That's my cross to bear. That's really not the point. The cross is something you can take up, and it's something you can lay down. It's something you decide that you're going to take, and that cross then becomes, again, following after the suffering of Jesus.
It's a denial of self, and to a degree, if you boast about carrying your cross, you've not carried out what's being said there, because you're boasting more in yourself than you are in what the intent is there. And it's an interesting contrast we often just overlook and forget about.
Yeah, a very simple way to think through it. Being the youngest but not the smallest brother in my family, as a kid, I regularly would pester my older brothers. This is what you do. And as also a kid, when they would smack back, I would respond like a child. Hey, why are you hitting me? Why are you messing with me? Why are you always picking on little brother? Well, it's because I instigated the problem. And I think as believers, as Christians, sometimes we behave like the little brother and create a conflict in order to get the attention that we desire, spiritual or otherwise, not thinking through that the attention we receive isn't going to be the thing that we wanted. We certainly wanted attention, but not the kind that we're going to get in the end, both from our older siblings and then the supervising authorities, which are parents. It's all going to go downhill from there. And that's not at all Paul's context. He's not poking hornets' nests. He is doing the kind of service that is hard when no longer you think of yourself. Great discussion to introduce the book. There's a lot that's going to go on in here. Doy, thanks again for adjusting your schedule and bringing your expert brain to the table. We greatly.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. The expert part can be put in quotes. But
yeah.
Thank you.
Folks can make a judgment on their own as to the quality of insight from the participants. But we do a thing at the close of this. We go around the horn for those sports fanatics who have missed out on their sports references for ESPN and other shows. We come around the horn, and this is a chance for extra little tidbits that might be a benefit to the brethren, projects you're working on, anything that you think is important. Terry, why don't you go off and start our Around the Horn segment as we close out our study for today.
Well, I just appreciate Doy joining us. It was kind of a late edition. He did a great job, and always good to be with him. And hopefully soon, Doy and we live just minutes apart. Hopefully we can be together in the flesh again soon, and all this kind of be back to normal. Just encourage everybody to, especially at this time, we're in a time of transition. Keep praying for our nation, for our country. Pray for your leaders at your congregations. We talked a little bit earlier, Doy and I did, about what our congregations are doing. Those are tough decisions we're all making, and we want to make sure we make the best. I heard a story again today about another church that didn't probably make the best decisions, but there's an outbreak again. And so that's probably our greatest fear when we talk as leaders about what we're doing at this time. So just continue to pray for those leaders and do the best you can to support them and encourage them, even when you disagree with them on things like this, and continue to serve the Lord and be willing to suffer, but also through all things glorify Him.
Yeah. Joy, what you got for us?
Again, I can't help sometimes make the comparison between Corinth and modern America. We're a lot like them in a lot of ways. The opportunities to excel and to do great things offset by the opportunities to commit great sin and at the same time beat each other's throats. And we need to back up and recognize that, there's a greater authority here in Jesus Christ. We are Christ is our King, not Caesar. And to recognize that suffering for the cause of Christ is not a bad thing. It's not that we're seeking it out, but we need to be servants of the Lord first and foremost, and do everything we can then to encourage one another to keep the faith. Right now has been a particularly difficult time, and we need that encouragement and strength. So I appreciate what you guys are doing throughout all this.
Stoy. So before we wrap up, I wanted to make note of one thing. My friend Mike Walls, who many of you who have been watching these studies have gotten to meet and to know. I know Doy knows some of his family from his youth and upbringing. Is on his way out to California to visit his grandmother Ruth, who's 99 years of age, and has started to have some difficulties with her health, and unrelated to the COVID condition. It's just a factor of her extended life. And ask for folks to pray for Ruth, pray for the entire Walls and Hooper family. And as many folks know right now, family interactions are really challenging. Some folks are really separated from one another. You may have seen videos of people creating these plastic shield walls with arms. You can kind of get some gloves so you can hug family members. We're all a little anxious and nervous on how do we interact in this new temporary context. But I want to make this last reminder: it's temporary. I don't know what tomorrow will look like, but I know that all these things are temporary. Uh, and in the big picture of things, a couple of things are on the table. Either the Lord returns, and I look forward to that, or between now and then, things continue to change. If we can get rid of our attachment to stuff, think about how much better our plan will be between now and when the Lord returns. We might have recognized that the relationships we have are really the things that matter the most, whether it's relationship to Christ and our Creator, or to our family and to our brethren. If we can help you in some way, if you want to know more about God and know more about Christ, reach out to us. I know Doyle will be happy to answer any questions. Terry and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. We'd love to talk. Everyone have a great day, and may God bless you.